I don't pay big bucks for expensive AI tools. We use the basic stuff that I can teach my companies and my HR teams how to use for day-to-day tactical things.
Welcome to Tip Top Grow Up Your Business with Metronomics. Join me, Shannon Burns-Husko, and Metronomics certified coach, Jed Roberts.
We'll be talking to business thought leaders, entrepreneurs, CEOs, and business team coaches who have all taken the journey to grow up their businesses to their tip top.
We'll be sharing strategies, systems, stories, on how you can grow your company up at the speed you want.
If you're searching for your path to the tip top and feel your time is running out, then this podcast is for you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. So I'm in the studio today with DeeAnn Palin, who is based in Scottsdale, Arizona. That's right, isn't it, DeeAnn?
Yes, it is.
It is. So we're going to have a conversation today, which is going to be an interesting one because we are taking DeeAnn's unique perspective as both a Metronomics coach and the CEO of her own company concurrently. We're going to talk through some of the things that challenge us around the cohesive system, around the human system, and just drill down a little bit more detail from those two different perspectives. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. DeeAnn, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so you've been a Metronomics coach for, is it 2-3 years now?
2 years.
2 years, yeah. And how tell us a little bit about your business. Tell us a little about how that came together and also how you came to be a coach.
Sure. I spent about 20 years starting as a human resource executive in companies and quickly grew into a COO and mostly doing growth planning and turnarounds and cleanups of operations. And at a point, 2014, decided to go off on my own and work directly with CEOs, coaching for business growth. Ironically, I found out that a huge part of growth, stagnation, and the stumbling blocks and the frustration CEOs had, a lot of it was around, do we have the right human systems? Do we have the right talent? Do we have the right processes? Do we have the right leadership structure? Do we have the right accountabilities? And it just was a repeated pattern over and over again. And that's a big part of why I started my human resource fractional business and why I embraced Metronomics as a coach, because it really understands and grasps the fact that if you don't have the right people in place and the right processes, you're going to drive right in the ditch or not drive at all.
It's all about the people, right?
Sure is.
Yeah, I published a book last year, and chapter 1, the title of chapter 1 is called "It's the Team, Stupid." You haven't got the right people on the bus, then you're not going to get too far down the road.
That's right. I tell my CEOs running a company is super fun, but you got to, remember that you've got the people to bring on the bus too. And that's sometimes not the most fun, is getting everybody on there, getting the right people in place. Once you have them, it's awesome.
Yeah. I run quite a few public workshops around Metronomics. And one of the things we ask very, very early on is, what's the biggest barrier? What's slowing you down as you try and grow your business? And nearly every single time, the answer is people.
Yes.
Don't have the right
yes.
people. Yeah, don't have the right skills. Can't find the right people.
I'll tell you a little secret. It's not going to be a secret anymore, obviously. But when I was in human resources, I actually hated doing that work because it was always seen as the police, the parent, the compliance officer, the cost center. And it wasn't until I moved into that COO role, really looking at profitability and growth and revenue, I kept hitting those same walls all of the time and just couldn't get over some of those hurdles on how do we grow revenue? How do we become more profitable? And every single time it traced back to the human systems. And I realized this isn't a cost center. This is a growth engine if you do it right.
And that's an interesting point because, people often see HR as being, one of those other cost centers. And, how do you change the perspective of a leadership team? How do you change the perspective of a team that, HR is something that costs money rather than actually can help generating new revenue?
It's probably good to give you an example because I think that's more telling than anything. I worked with a big private investigation company out of Chicago, and just as a point of reference, they were in 22 states. They had a ton of seasonality. They're hiring, 400 private investigators. Their turnover rate was over 100%. They're shipping people off to different states to fulfill jobs, costing tons of overtime and hotel and other expenses. And I was working with them and realized just how many dollars that were just going out the window. I mean, we may as well have been ripping up $100 bills. And we contracted to clean up their recruiting process, implement an applicant tracking system, help them really put a good onboarding training, clean up that whole system, and just conservatively running the numbers on overtime save, churn on requisitions. We spent $10,000 on that ATS system, and I know conservatively we saved them over 1.3 million in a 24-month period. So that's not even ongoing. So it's that kind of story that is so compelling because companies can't figure out why their margins are so tight. And it's because oftentimes their people systems are not mathematical until you really dig into the back office of it.
Yeah, so a great return on investment there.
A pretty good return on investment. You can think of outsourcing human resources as an expense until you see some return like that and it shows up on the bottom line. And he was positioning to sell within 12 months. So all of that money saved is EBITDA and multiplier, right? So that makes a company very happy.
Yes, yes. So you walk into a new organization, and be interested to hear your perspective, the different perspective as a coach and as a fractional HR business. You walk into a company and you see straight away that the leadership team is dysfunctional. Yeah.
Mhm.
What do you do?
I've never seen that, Jed.
Yeah.
Usually, you can see it pretty quickly when there is a dysfunctional team. And, I remind people of that process. You've got the forming, storming, norming, performing. And sometimes it's about the team dynamic and not having the whole team together and aligned. But I think it's really, really important to make sure that we have clear roles and goals and scorecards and a lot of the tools and systems that Metronomics provides in that human cohesion system is let's be really clear that we know what the functions are of the organization, who owns what. Oftentimes, when you start with an organization, two or three people own some functional outcome, or nobody really owns it. There's three or four names on it, but nobody has ultimate accountability, and we don't know what success looks like. So, the first thing I do is make sure we're crystal clear about what the key functions need to be in the company and who's in the seats of those. And then what are we measuring to know success, right? And the second thing is working on the value system and the purpose and making sure there's alignment that also aligned to their key function flow map in terms of what are we trying to accomplish, how many of what's going to get us from here to there. Uh, I do some work with Lencioni's. He's such a classic, it's a blast from the past, but it's good, timely important stuff to really focus on what it takes to build trust, accountability, and ultimately get to that high performing team.
Yeah. Yeah. You talked about a few topics there, and we might come back and sort of revisit those. But to the listeners out there, if you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you get to hear as new episodes drop. So, Dan, just picking up on a few topics there, you talked about functional accountability, and as coaches, whenever we walk into an organization, as you mentioned, there is never clarity of functional accountability. You mentioned that often most organizations have more than one person who is accountable for something. It often seems to be marketing for some reason. Not sure why it's marketing, but seems to be that. And you also mentioned where there's that sometimes we don't know how to assess whether a function is operating correctly. Now, how do we actually measure success in an organization? So let's take a step back there. And when you run a kickoff or a first meeting, are you taking the leadership teams through these exercises? How do you go about doing those?
Yes, the key function chart and key function flow map to me are they seem so fundamental and almost simple. They're simple, but they're hard. They're the hard facts that get you clarity around what needs to be done by who and how much of what. And oftentimes organizations make assumptions about what a function is, and we have typical org charts, and you might have marketing. You gave a great example where the CEO has one idea of what successful marketing looks like. The person that's in the seat has another view, and the team that works for that person has a third view. And then all of their peers are annoyed because they're not doing what they thought that person should be doing. So, a lot of dysfunction in an organization and in a leadership team comes from people just not fulfilling expectations of the other person, and you can't fulfill expectations that aren't set correctly. So that to me is so fundamental. And then the second part of that, and this is again where the human system and human resources really is a driver of profitability. You're so inefficient when you have that kind of dysfunction on a leadership team. It takes longer to make decisions. You make decisions and people walk out of the room and don't follow through on it. We don't know what we're actually trying to accomplish. There's 1,000 ways that shows up symptomatically, and it's just so important to kind of start with, do we have the right people in the team? Do they know what they need to accomplish? Do they know how they support each other? Do they know how they're driving business to get at profitability and outcomes? And so that's fundamental. And then you really have to look at, now that we know all of that, do we have A players? And this is where things like top grading come into place. Do we have A players on the team? Do we have people that are aligned from a values perspective? Do they have the right competence and skill set to be able to execute what we outlined? If you don't, we've got some tough decisions to make in there. And I call it helping people be successful somewhere else. But a lot of times, CEOs and organizations struggle with letting people go because they grew up with the organization. A lot of us work with foundation or founder led companies. And, this person's been with me 15 years. And what we realize at some of these critical moments is what got us here isn't going to get us there. And we have to upgrade those skill sets. And it's really, really important to recognize that B or C players, non A players don't hire A players, and A players won't work for C players, C leaders. So there's nothing more important than really clarifying what you need in those roles and making sure that we're growing up the business to be able to deliver on that. And that means making sure you have a team of A players that will hire, grow, retain A players that work for them. And that's all about revenue and that's all about profitability. And don't let anybody make you think it's soft skill.
No, absolutely. And when as a coach we walk into an organization, you never ever see an A player leadership team. Because if you had an A player leadership team, they might not need a coach or they might not call a coach in. But it gets very tricky when you see a leadership team that is not all A players, but there's maybe one or two B players there. And one of the things we have to do as coaches is help the CEO understand, are they B players that you can develop, or are they B players that ultimately you're going to have to replace? Now, how have you addressed that sort of, develop, replace decision making? Because it's often not clear cut, and it can change over time as well. Someone might be a B player develop, B player develop, and then they slip back a little bit, and it gets to the point where okay, they're not going to make an A player, but are they going to be a good enough B player? Well, that's a bit of an oxymoron anyway. How do you approach that decision making?
There's a couple of things that I do, and it kind of depends where the team is at. So I think most of us have seen or used a typical 9-box grid. To me, for the organizations we're working with, especially when they're in these fast growth, what got you here isn't going to get you there kind of modes, I'm a simpleton. I create a 4-box grid, and up one axis is potential and across the other is performance. And so, for example, the top right box is high potential, high performance, and the bottom left is low potential, low performance. And I literally work with the leadership team to plot who they've got in the organization. And before we even start that, we talk about what do we expect of this executive team in terms of role. We talked about all the functional scope and the metrics, and the other really, really important thing is, do they have the culture fit and the capacity to help grow the organization? So we start the whole conversation about what it means to be high potential, high performance, around culture, around executive presence, around growth capability. And then we plot the leaders of that organization. And I've done this through an entire organization, all the way down to the front line. And we begin having conversations. If you've got someone who's high potential, low performance, they're usually either brand new to the job, or as a leadership team, we haven't done our job to clarify their expectations, their role, their scope, their responsibility for capacity and function and leadership and culture. And so we build development plans. We build development plans for all 4 of those grids. And I'll tell you, I'm pretty hard on my leadership teams. If you've got a group of people in that lower left quadrant, the low potential, low performance, they don't get to stay there. That's a up or out in 30 days box. At the high potential, high performance, you better be coaching like crazy. Your high potential, high performance, your scope needs to grow. You need to support them. You need to stretch them. You need to promote them. And the one box that I would say a lot of people take for granted is that bottom right box, which is the low potential, high performance. Those are your soldiers. Those are the folks in the organization who are your rock stars, your steady hands. They're A players too. And so it's really, really important for a leadership team to look at all 4 of those quadrants. And a really cool thing happens. I call it a talent calibration, because it really does calibrate that whole leadership team on what's important for us to have as a talent pool. And the other thing it does is it causes your talent to be owned by the entire executive team. And that is a monumental shift that builds momentum like nothing you've ever seen. So I do that same work with the CEO in private in their coaching sessions about the executive team, and we have some tough conversations there too.
Yeah. And you've got to get those conversations into the team as well. Not when you're talking about other members of the leadership team, but I ran a session with a client recently, and they'd adopted the team assessment, so the nine box grid with culture and performance, and they'd been pretty aggressive at sort of weeding out anyone that wasn't in the top right or the top center, but they still had 2 people that they were, yeah, they just weren't convinced about. They just didn't seem to be developing. They weren't coming along through the process. They weren't improving. They weren't listening to feedback. And I just put the question out there. So what are we going to do about these 2? And there was a bit of a awkward silence, and someone then piped up, "Well, they need to go, don't they?" And I know, yeah, they do need to go. And it's interesting how the once one person spoke out, then the rest were happy to sort of say, "Yeah, I agree. This has been a problem. We need to deal with this." When by the time we walked out of the room, there were 2 30-minute meetings booked in the afternoon with the CEO and the HR leader, and they were going to get moved off the building. They were going to get moved out of the building. They were gone. And no, that's not brutal. That's just reality. That's making tough decisions, which you have to do in business. But it's also best for them, because if they're not happy in the organization, if they're not contributing, if they're not performing to the best of their abilities, then you're better off giving the opportunity to find their success somewhere else in another organization.
It's so true. I mean, usually if people aren't A players, um, now this with the caveat that there are some people that are delusional, but usually people know if they're not performing, if they're not living up to standards, and it's a gift to be honest and direct. And I find sometimes that it's the CEO or the executive's responsibility that they haven't done what they need to do to clarify expectations, and that's why I talked about that function map and the key metrics and getting clear about those scorecards. But if you've done that and you've had good coaching communication, the kindest thing you can do is release that person into the wild, right? So, um, critically important. And I'll just close with saying we did this exercise with a nonprofit organization. It's a $25 million nonprofit, and they have a profit arm of their business, revenue generating. And we sat with the executive team and did this assessment on all 120 of their employees. And what we found was one of those executive leaders, her entire leadership team was in that bottom left corner. So, this is that example of when you own talent by the whole group, they're going to hold the leader, their peer, accountable to the standard that we discussed on the front end. I mean, it gets a little messy. It was emotional for her, and at the end of that discussion, the whole team rallied and said, "Here's what we need to do. Let's build a plan," and we put dates on it. And when we closed out that 2-day session, the CEO closed by saying, "We changed our culture today." We literally changed our culture in a 2-hour exercise. And they went away and in 30 days executed that whole plan, including that executive leader being gone. So it's so eye-opening to have these kinds of conversations and these exercises, and it builds ownership. You don't get to mess around anymore because we're putting the elephant on the table, and we're building real objective outcomes and measurables and accountability. And there's just something to be said for that. And if you go back to what we talked about in the beginning about how important that human and cohesive system is, those are not soft side of the business. I would go to toe with anybody that tells me that I can save you more money and grow more revenue by focusing on the human and cohesive system than any other system in the business.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about how HR and human systems and the cohesive systems can help organizations. But one of the things that I've often wondered about is how do you assess how HR is functioning? How do you assess how people and culture, call it what you like? What measures would you put in place, if you went into an organization and said, okay, every other function has got their measures. These are the measures for HR. What would you say that?
I will just tell you, this goes back to my "I don't like HR" comment. Because I think so often in HR, we measure how many employee relations issues we handled, and we measure how many people we hired, and all of that is really, really important tactically. But if you don't have the data to drive the business decisions, how many of what kind of position do we need to deliver those widgets or those products to customers? We're opening a new facility in 6 months and we need X people. What is the drag on that hiring process? Are we getting them hired on time? Um, are we able for service industries especially, but manufacturing industry, anybody that's delivering a product, if we're not staffed appropriately, you're missing opportunity to sell stuff, right? And to deliver on time. And you lose customers because customers are annoyed that they're not being handled correctly, right? And they're not getting their products on time, which makes them not able to create revenue or outcomes. And so a long way to answer your question is we better be measuring the impacts we're having on revenue and expense. And one of the first things I do when we're hired by a company to come in and evaluate their HR function or to supplement their HR function, we dig right into not just the things that cause them to be compliant, but we look at their systems and processes and their expenses. We look at their benefit contracts. We look at their compensation plans. We look at their market rates for how they're paying. We help them create strategies to say, okay, you have the highest turnover in a key function that's frontline to your customers, and that's causing you to lose customers and have slow burn. We need to change your compensation strategy and pay that group of people above market and focus on onboarding and focus on, training and outcomes and leadership development, and make sure that we've got all the systems that make that a nurturing, healthy, thriving environment for those folks. Because if we don't have those people that are delivering your core function for the organization, we're a cost center and we're costing. It's not just an expense, we're costing you business.
So you're painting a picture there of, people and culture, HR, whatever you want to call it, as being more proactive, being more of a strategic partner rather than a reactive, we hire people if you ask us to.
Right. If you're, we look for lagging indicators like turnover, like recruiting costs, like, compensation dollars, like how much our benefits are costing relative to the market. All of those measures are super important. But what you should be looking at is, where are we driving outcomes for the business? Does our benefit plan attract the kind of people that we want and the kind of behaviors we need? And I'll give you an example of that. One of the head of HR, head of operations functions I had was helping privatize a state agency into A+ rated insurance company. You can imagine the culture shift there. Our benefit plan was crazy rich. I think it cost $5 per employee, and this was in the early 2000s, so it wasn't 1922. It was relatively recent, and our pay was in a horrible state. And so we were attracting all kinds of people that were sick, non-productive, didn't want to be there, punching the clock, lights out at 4:30 p.m. And if you're going to create a performance-driven culture and high performance A+ rated insurance, you have to turn that on its head and say, how do we pay for A players? And how do we create a benefit plan that attracts and retains high performers, not low performers who are sick? And we put all kinds of wellness programs in place and support for coaching and development. And it took us some time. You don't move a state agency overnight, but we transformed that company. You wouldn't have recognized it 3 years later.
It's pretty easy to spot a high performer, but how do you hire, or how do you attract and hire for culture fit? Now that always to me seems to be one of the trickiest things because it's people oriented, performance. Well, you can measure that relatively easily, but culture fit's not so easy. How do you go about doing that? Do you use any specific assessments or interview techniques? Now that would be very useful for people listening in.
Yeah, I'll tell you, there's a couple of, I think, critical things to do, and I do this with my leadership teams when we kick off. When we're building the values, we get down to the behavior level. So if we're talking about integrity or teamwork or any of the other, standard values that are up on boards, Enron had those, and look what happened to them, right? So we're getting down into what does it look like to get results or be high performing? Who are the people in the organization that show up that way? And we define those in behaviors that are in the language of the company and in values that are in the language of the company. And then we build those questions into the interview questions. We build it into rewards and recognition. We build it into incentive comp. You just heard me say we build it into the talent assessment. We make sure that is in every fiber of the organization, but it has to be at that behavioral level, because if you don't know what it looks like when you've got it, you sure don't know what it looks like when you don't.
Yeah, but people can second guess what you're looking for in an interview question. You can do situational interviews, style questions around, you know, give me an example of where you demonstrated this value. And like, God, I mean, when I was still applying for jobs, which is a long time ago, I knew what was coming next. I knew how to answer those questions. And
Yeah, you have the package.
yeah, so how do you actually get past that, giving people the answer? How do you get past when people are giving you the answer that they know or think you want rather than the true answer? Because ultimately you're looking for the true answer, not the answer they want to give you.
Right, and we won't get into the whole top grading process in detail, but there's a couple of really fundamental important things to do. One is, check references. If you skip asking the questions and checking references, even though those folks give you the names, you can ask questions that really get at who is this person and how did they show up. The other thing I like to do is bring that candidate in to sit with their peers, to sit with a couple of people that they'll be interacting with and have lunch with them. See how they interact in a group. It doesn't always have to be through interview questions. Yeah, you want to ask behavioral interview questions and situational stuff, but like you said, people have their canned answers and they know how to show up for that. When I'm hiring executives, I invite them and their spouse to dinner with the executive leadership team, or at least the CEO and the president. I want to see how they show up. I track that person from the minute they walk in the front door. How do they interact with the receptionist? How do they interact with people in the hallway? How are they sitting in the reception area? Right? So you want to see how they engage on all levels. When you're walking through the hallway, do they say hello to people? When you take them to your cafe or out to lunch, how do they treat the service people? It's really, really important to hire slow and fire fast. I think that's not a cliche. That's a real thing.
Yeah, so your assessment is as much based outside of the interview situation as it is in. Now, because that's where people really show their true behaviors when they feel that they're not being interviewed.
Yeah, I say take them out of the fishbowl. Take the fish out of the fishbowl, right? See how they flop. Can they handle the land, right?
Yeah. So earlier on, you said you mentioned. I think I understood when you said you hate the term HR. I mean, so do I. What should we call this function in an organization?
Well, I don't necessarily hate the term HR. What I hate is what it pulls forward in terms of, when I talk to CEOs or any operational level person, you if you said you need to talk to HR, they shudder, right? Like it's, "Oh, don't make me do that," or I don't know what value that's going to bring, or they're just going to put me through hoops, or they're going to tell me what I did was wrong. That is not the role of HR. So if you have to change the title of it to talent management, to whatever, call it whatever you need to call it, but the mindset's what really matters. It's really got to be a partner. You're there to help the CEO and that executive team run the business, not just run it, but put fuel in the tank for that business. If you're the one pumping the brakes or driving it in the ditch, then that is not a function you want in your organization. And I will tell you, a lot of the organizations we work with, we talked about what got you here isn't going to get you there. Usually when I'm interacting with the CEO and they're in this huge growth cycle, their controller is managing HR, their office manager, sometimes their spouse is managing HR. And so they're doing the tactical payroll, the management of um, processing pay employees to get on board, to posting jobs. They're doing all the tactical things that are absolutely required, but that's HR administration. HR leadership is a rare gem. If you have an HR leader that really understands the growth engine of talent and people, you've got an agent on your side that can help you really, again, get that profitability, get the revenue growth, create a culture where people actually want to show up and stay, and your productivity goes up immensely, it's money well spent, and most companies can't afford to bring that inside right away. If you're 20 to 200 employees, you can't afford, nor do you necessarily need a full-time strategic HR partner. But having someone in that seat to coach your team is critical.
So, Deanne, you talked about not every organization being able to justify or need sort of a full-time head of HR, head of people. But you probably see the similar things in organizations where they hit certain trigger points, they hit certain milestones, whether it's revenue or number of people or number of functions. What are the things that you look out for that say to you, it's now time to start investing more heavily in the people side of the business?
Yes, I think, once you're at 200 employees, you should have an HR team, a strategic HR leader, probably a full-time recruiter, probably an HR generalist, probably a HR coordinator. Sometimes those positions can be blended with the recruiter. It really depends on how heavy the load is on those various functions, what that team needs to look like. Um, that's not to say every organization at 200 employees has to have a strategic HR person. You can outsource that function and just make sure you have a well-run team. You can hire a fractional quarterback in there, but you've really got to be having some solid systems in place. And some of those systems include a really good payroll system, a great benefit broker, an HRIS system, a really tight recruiting and onboarding process, ways that you're managing culture and outcomes. If you don't have those functions up and running in a solid way, you're going to be bleeding right out the back end. You're going to hire people. It's going to cost you more to hire them, more to manage them, harder to track them, harder to retain them, and then you're gonna go through that whole cycle again. So if you see a CEO that is feeling like they're on a hamster wheel, when it comes to talent, they're just exhausted, burnout, frustrated. It feels like it's costing them a ton of money. It's because they probably aren't looking at it strategically.
Yeah, because you talked about a whole bunch of different functions, and they're very, very different skill sets there. Some recruitment is different to, strategic HR, strategic people leading, isn't it? So it's unlikely that one person is going to be able to fulfill all those roles. And if they try, they're probably not going to do a great job at all of them.
Right. That to me is where I found this niche. It's the black hole. You're exactly right. It is the place where, you can't afford six people on your team. You can't afford a professional recruiter, a professional strategic HR person, a professional, if y- most companies that are growing, they don't have the luxury of having all of that full time. So I joke sometimes that, we think we're gonna find that unicorn, and you're just not. You might find some people that have a mix of skills, like some of the generalists with recruiting or training with, HR management. Like, you may get a couple of those functions covered, so it better be the right ones and the important ones, and then I would just say outsource. The other thing that I think is often a fallacy about HR is that it's all social, people facing, connection with employees, and you need that clearly. But a huge part of a well oiled HR machine is that you've got that back office covered, that they know how to work with the CFO or the head of finance to look at how are we spending those dollars, and are we leveraging them correctly, and how are we retaining our top talent? How are we paying in the market? How are we spending those recruiting dollars? If you look at the payroll cost of any company, it's I can't say I've ever found an example where it's not in the top 3 expenses for a company. And so if that's not run well, your company's not run well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And sometimes that lives with finance, sometimes it lives with HR or people and culture. And where do you think that should go? Because that's one of the ones that is often sort of in different functions in the business. Where do you think it should go?
there are some really phenomenal heads of finance, really strategic heads of finance that are basically second in command in a business and they're visionaries. But there's a lot of finance people that aren't wired that way. They're wired to manage the dollars and the outcomes, and they're more tactical, compliance driven, data driven. So having HR reporting into that kind of function when it's supposed to be the fuel for your organization, you're burying that opportunity and usually have a tourniquet around their neck, right? So they're not able to look at the business as a growth engine. So, first of all, if you want HR to be a driver for the business, it should sit at the table with the executive team and be right in the ear and at the right hand of the CEO. And you better have a good person doing that. You don't want a cruddy one in that role because you're spending money on something that is a cost center then. So the first thing is, are they strategic? Can they sit at that table? The one place I would say finance should play a hand, I like to keep payroll out of HR. There's a lot of people that would argue one way or another. I think they need to feed payroll to the finance team, but you've got to have that check and balance so that who's inputting the data is not the same people approving and pushing it through.
One thing we haven't talked about so far is scorecards. That tool that comes from the top grading process that we love and is well represented in the software that we use. How do you have an approach for coming up with scorecards? Because people do it very differently, and a lot of people focus on competencies. Some people focus on the accountabilities. Some it's more about the numbers. Do you have an approach to how to put together good scorecards?
You just asked a trick question because I do a lot of work facilitating that, and I work with the CEO and coaching it, and we use the work of the function chart and the key accountabilities and the metrics. But then I cheat a little bit. I work with that CEO or that executive team once we've defined sort of the fundamental key accountabilities, and I feed that into Chat GPT and I'll tell the industry, I'll tell the size, I'll talk about the growth projections, I'll feed it all of the information about the company and where it's going and the reporting structures and um, as much as we've already decided. And I'll ask my friend Bez, who is my Chat GPT buddy, to help me develop a scorecard that has the key functions, the competencies, the metrics, for that industry, best practice for that growth trajectory. And usually it gets us about 80% of the way there. So if I've done that initial work with the leadership team, feed it in there, and then we load it into the scorecards, and I'll have the CEO work with their executive one-on-one to tighten it up and finalize it. And it has been a really smooth process.
Well, I think that's a great example of where developments in AI can really make a difference, and that would have taken weeks of work coming up with a set of scorecards for a company a few years ago, wouldn't it?
Right. And, I do the similar work with the values. I do the work with the executive team, and then I get lists of what those behaviors might look like. And then I feed that into Chat GPT and tell them the industry type, the employee makeup, the goals of the company, the revenue projections, um, anything I can that might feed what this culture should look like and what tone and language it should be in. You feed those into Chat GPT, they can do better work in an hour than I or my team could do in 3 weeks. And I'll tell you, I brought a program like that to an executive team I was working with as a new manufacturing company, and we spent the hour and a half on the value section. And I said, let me take this away. We're not going to wordsmith here, and I fed it into Chat GPT, and I came back, and the senior finance guy was this sage, amazing man from South America. And he said, the only way I can describe how perfect these are is to tell you in the Spanish language, there's two words for a picture or a photograph. And he said, one is the true photograph, the portrait. He said the other is when you take that 100th picture and you capture the essence of the person. He said, that's what you just did. That's what you've done here. And I thought, holy cow, that's not what I did here. That's what our tools did, right? So that initial conversation and then the finessing and having the intelligence of our AI tools to help us build that out made it phenomenal for them.
Yeah. And like everything, you choose the right tool for the right job.
Yeah, and I don't pay big bucks for expensive AI tools. We use the basic stuff that I can teach my companies and my HR teams how to use for day-to-day tactical things.
Yeah. Mhm. So another topic I wanted to spend a little bit of time on today was five dysfunctions of a team. Now that's something that I bring into the leadership teams that I work with very very soon, very quickly, and it's often a revelation to leadership teams because if you've worked in business, you've inevitably been in a business that is dysfunctional, and most people just assume that's just how it is. Now, most people assume that if they're in a leadership team, they're going to be fighting, and it's not nice fighting. It's not fighting it's to address or solve a problem. It's like we just don't get on. Even the notion that you can build a cohesive leadership team seems to be, in the first instance, foreign to a lot of people. And I think that is just something that is such a miss for companies. And the way Patrick Lencioni framed up that model, it's just perfect, I think. And you can pull the narrative around that story together just so beautifully. Uh, how do you use five dysfunctions?
Well, I wanna hear how you use it too, but, I usually go through each level with the leadership team, and talk about trust, and that trust really comes down to competence. You trust that they've got the competence to do the job, but you also trust that they've got your back. And we talk about the fact that you need both of those kinds of trust, or trust doesn't exist, and we kind of work our way up through accountability and conflict management and results, and then I ask them to assess themselves as a leadership team. I've used the table group assessments and had them bring that into the room, and that works really well too. But sometimes just going through sort of a rudimentary, basic conversation, having them score, and then we talk about that, what they scored, where they think they are, what it would take to get to green if they're red on a certain level. And then from there, I'll lay a foundation to say, okay, how do we need to work together as a leadership team to achieve the high level of trust and accountability and performance that Lencioni outlines here. And so we develop a set of guidelines or rules of engagement, and I'll come back to those as we're working through issues in the organization on their quarterly sessions. So I think it's really important to make sure they have a foundation for it, and then they have some agreements about how they're going to work to get it more functional and stay functional, what they're gonna do when they feel like it's off, and then how often are they gonna visit it, and I make sure I remember to build that into my plans every 6 months or annually.
So I introduced the five dysfunctions model at the kickoff. So normally
Yeah.
before lunchtime on day one, they've had the model explained to them, and you sometimes see sort of puzzlement, or you mean we can actually work well
Talk
together.
about this? Yeah.
There's actually a way where it doesn't have to be dysfunctional, and then what I do is I use certain different assessments as I move through the first quarter of my leadership team. So the first one I do is DISC. Now, DISC is all about self-awareness. It's about showing people where their behavioral styles lie, and also how they lie in relation to other people. And once I've done DISC and I've done the DISC debrief, both individually and as a group, the next tool I bring out is the five dysfunctions, because at that stage they've learned a little bit about the other people in their leadership team, as individuals, as behavioral styles. So they've got an anchor point onto which they can start to hang behaviors. And then once that just makes the conversation around five dysfunctions a lot easier, because they've got labels to hang things off. Oh, right, okay. When you do this, it's because, yeah, okay, that happened in your past, that happened in your history. And we've already started working on cohesive system or cohesive team, because we do that pretty much at 9 o'clock on day one, because, very subtly, they started to realize they can have conversations that they wouldn't have before. And I remember a CEO interrupting me. I think we were sort of halfway through the afternoon, where the team were passionately debating, where they wanted to be in 3 years' time as their 3-hack statement. And the CEO stopped me and he said, "We couldn't have had this conversation 2 weeks ago. We couldn't have had this conversation 2 weeks ago because we didn't trust each other enough to be open and vulnerable and really get our thoughts out there. So we used to make decisions where we just weren't bought in." And so quickly, he was already starting to use the language of 5 dysfunctions. He was talking about, we've only just started this and I can see there's more trust. And, we're having these conflicts and they're not bad conflicts, they're good conflicts. And so the model is so simple. It's just beautiful. It just helps people work it through themselves by giving labels to hang things on. So I love it as a tool. Yeah, I love it as a tool. Introduce it as quickly as possible, and very, very quickly I see the language being being used and referred back to me.
Yeah, it's a first session, first day thing, right? It lays the whole foundation. And I've used DISC, I've used predictive index. My favorite tool is culture index, just because it's simple and easy to use, but they're all phenomenal. And what that does is it takes the emotion out of the room. It really helps you look at how the people in the room are wired. So if you have their key accountabilities or core function in their wiring, it's really hard to take things so personally anymore if you've got it all based on the 5 dysfunctions model. So it really takes that team from I don't like this person because they don't look or act or do things the way I do it and they slow me down or they're sloppy or whatever it is that your DISC or culture index might define as your strength or weakness. That's different than theirs is usually what the rub is personally. And as soon as you can turn that into data and logic, all of a sudden you've got a team. It's like looking at a piece of equipment or a group of equipment in a manufacturing facility saying, why are they not interacting or working through the process? You go in and you clean up that process. Well, you better do the same with the leadership team and the people in the organization, right?
And luckily, we have the tools to be able to do that.
It's phenomenal. It really is. I've coached CEOs for over 20 years and, created strategic plans and you feel like you're handing them their newborn and they don't know how to grow it up. Or it sits on a shelf and it's going to collect dust and that's worrisome, right? And what I love about the Metronome system is you get the strategy based on a long-term lighthouse BHAG with purpose and values for how we're going to operate. And then you dig into that cash system, you dig into the human system, and you have all the plans in place to execute. And so many of these different organizations or tools that people describe as competitors of Metronomics, they're really not. They're a good place to start. And I truly believe that people grow up into the metronome system. It's when you put all of those pieces together and you operate in the kind of cadence and format that we have, that's where the power comes and that's where the fast growth and prep for transition comes in.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way to wrap up the session today. So we've talked about the cohesive system, we talked about the human system and a bunch of other things. If the viewers want to get in touch with you, Deanne, where should they go?
Our website, LinkedIn, any of those are great locations. So it's onptbiz.com, or you can find me at DeeAnn Palin on LinkedIn or On Point on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, that's awesome. Thanks so much for your time today, Deanne. That's great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tip Top is brought to you by Metronomics.
To find out more about Metronomics and how this proven 20-year-old system will save you time and money as you grow up your business,
visit metronomics.com. That is metronomics.com.
Share your thoughts on today's episode in the comments and suggest topics you'd love us to explore the next time.
Also search for Metronomics in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and anywhere else that great podcasts are found.